It doesn't take a lot to say that if you call yourself a gamer, you've probably played a survival game at one point. Maybe you've played survival horror like Resident Evil, where limited resources and dangerous enemies put tension on the player. You've probably tried a survival sandbox like Minecraft, where players are tasked with finding and crafting resources in a dangerous world. Perhaps you've tried a real-time strategy game like Age of Empires, where quick thinking and long-term planning are required to manage a growing civilization. And if you go way back, you might have played an old educational strategy game like the Oregon Trail, where every decision you make counts as you gather and manage resources in a dangerous and randomized journey. My point is that survival has been a mechanic in games from the beginning, and over the years many of these franchises perfected and capitalized on survival as a genre. But today, I want to talk about a lesser-known gem that came and went before survival was a selling point. Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress. Developed for various computers and the ColecoVision in 1985 by Tom Lowry and Kerry Longaway, and published by Activision, a company that died in the 80s. The premise of Alcazar is simple. You play as an unnamed adventurer who is seeking out the lost kingdom of Alcazar to sit upon its magical throne. You don't play as an individual character in this game, but rather one of many adventurers, judging by the game's life system, which are adventurers you'll find trapped in some of the castles. The premise is simple, but a breakaway from most adventure games at the time. You're not rescuing a princess, defeating an evil villain, or even finding lost treasure. You're seeking magical power. For all we know, you're the antagonist in this story, stealing an ancient power guarded by the inhabitants of this land. But let's talk about the actual game. In order to reach Alcazar, you'll have to traverse several castles throughout the map. Each castle will contain different enemies and items. You'll encounter genies, guards, griffins that look like lizards, weird slugs, tigers, flies, and spiders. Your primary weapons throughout the game are pistols with limited ammunition, but some enemies will have weaknesses to specific items. For example, griffins will die if hit by oil, and slugs with bleach. And most enemies can even fall into traps, like bottomless pits or teleporting rugs, or even get stunned with stakes. But your main saving grace against stronger enemies, however, is that they give telltale signs when they're in nearby rooms. Flies make a loud buzzing noise, slugs leave goop on the floor, and genies will leave an urn nearby. It's up to the player to determine and single out which room contains the enemy, much like a more complex game of Minesweeper. And if you know which room the enemy is in, you can even shoot or throw an item into the room, killing them before they even see you. But if you shoot the wrong door or use the wrong item, they will rush into your room after you. The overworld randomizes with every new game, so you'll have to plan out your journey and which castles you'll want to enter and which shortcuts you'll take. If you enter a red castle, for example, you'll find a raft to cross the lake, minimizing your journey. However, you'll need to find water to kill genies, the most dangerous enemies in the game. And if you need extra lives, which are in the form of imprisoned explorers, as I said earlier, you'll need to traverse a black castle and fight guards, who carry jail keys and lack weaknesses. Strategy is key in reaching Alcazar, as you'll need to search for the right items, plan the safest route, and carefully tiptoe throughout each castle. Many of these mechanics, be it enemy weaknesses or the randomized overworld, were not unheard of for the time, but the way Alcazar uses all of them together creates so much depth for an otherwise simple top-down adventure, not to mention the mechanics that were unheard of at the time. In modern horror games like Five Nights at Freddy's, audio is essential for determining when an enemy is nearby, but in the 80s, audio was rarely an essential mechanic in an adventure game. For an otherwise simple-looking game on hardware that would soon be outdated, Alcazar makes the most out of its own limitations. Not many developers at the time put so much detail into the way you play their games. In many adventure games around the time, you're traveling from point A to point B, and either killing enemies or solving puzzles in between, not to mention the surging popularity in RPGs. But Alcazar the Forgotten Fortress doesn't treat itself like a video game. It treats itself like an adventure. It trusts the player with using strategy and resources to survive a perilous journey. In fact, every detail and bit of advice I've stated about this game can be found right in its manual, which reads off more like a survival guide, offering words of wisdom to inexperienced players. And this ties back to the topic of survival. Alcazar utilizes many of these mechanics that would later be engraved in the average survival game. You never feel empowered on your journey to Alcazar. You only feel relieved with every passing castle, and the harder the difficulty, the more tense you'll feel. On easy, the game holds your hand just enough to help you understand the mechanics. But on harder difficulties, the player is forced to rely on the game's instructions and mechanics to survive. On the hardest mode, number 4 for example, the game stops pulling punches and kicks your ass at every turn. You have 1 life, and nearly every enemy is extremely fast. The only way to beat the game is to slow down, play it safe, and avoid enemies if you can. It basically becomes a survival horror, before Sweet Home started the trend in 1989. And no matter how many times you die and see your progress on the map, you'll probably want to start a new game because the mechanics are so tight that you feel encouraged, just as much as you feel dread. Alcazar the Forgotten Fortress is a gem in survival games because it puts you in the shoes of an adventurer. Your journey is tough, but fair enough to make you feel responsible for every death. And once you finally sit upon that magical throne, you finally feel empowered because of your many triumphs getting there.